Hello everyone, today we're going to be discussing a true crime cold case that was solved after 40 years of investigation. Investigators almost had him a long time ago, but it was basically a fat finger typing error that caused this person to walk free. This is the true crime cold case of Joe Michael Ervin.
This has taken a long time. We can finally have peace knowing who did this to my little sister. We have closure. We're thankful for the hard work, determination of everybody involved here.
You know, like my brother said, it's been a long time coming, and now we can actually, really rest better at night.
My sister Ariel and I wanted to take time today to express our gratitude to the Denver Police Department and all agencies and individuals involved over the years for all of the hard work and the sacrifice in solving this series of horrific crimes. We are here to talk about our mother, Madeline Fury Livaday. She was a young woman with a very bright future. She was a writer, she was an ecologist, she was a loving wife, sister, daughter, and mother to two very young girls. But in 1978, she had that bright future ripped away from her.
This story begins on August 9th, 1969. 17-year-old high schooler Joe Ervin and his friend were loitering in the Berry Bowling Alley parking lot in Fort Worth, Texas. They noticed a car pulling into the parking lot and just parked there. Now, Joe and his friend were basically up to no good. They had no reason at all to be at that bowling alley and sitting in the parking lot. They weren't bowling, they were just sitting out there waiting to cause trouble, and that's exactly what they did. Inside the car that pulled up was 21-year-old Rodney Bonham and his friend Larry Holt. They were both there to meet some friends to go bowling. As they arrived at the bowling alley, they were getting ready to get out of the car and head in when they were confronted by Joe Ervin and his friend. As they were opening their car doors, Joe and his friend walked up and said, "What are you guys doing here? Are you waiting for some friends?" Bonham and Holt replied that they were just going to go into the bowling alley. Some friends were waiting for them there, and they were going to go bowling. Obviously, what else would you do at a bowling alley? For no reason at all, Joe pulled out a gun and shot Bonham in the base of the head. As Holt was sitting there terrified, Joe threatened him and said, "I'm going to do the same thing to you if you move." So he was basically trapped in the car. What else could he do? Joe and his friend were obviously amped up. They didn't know exactly what to do next. They were kind of fumbling for some keys. It almost seemed like they were going to try to steal the car. This was actually the perfect opportunity for Holt to be able to run away from them. They were both distracted, so he took the opportunity, opened the car door, and ran into the bowling alley. Ervin and his friend are now panicking. They know Holt got away. He ran into the bowling alley, and he is most likely calling the police. So they actually got in their vehicle and drove off. Bonham, with a gunshot wound to the base of his head, which is pretty much the head and neck area, was rushed to the hospital but died 4 days later. As law enforcement was starting their investigation, they released to the news outlets that this was essentially a senseless killing. There was no correlation between the suspect and the victim. Holt was obviously at the scene during this whole thing, so he was telling the police, I had no clue who these people were. They were just random. The same day this news story broke on TV, Joe decided to call the Bonham family. He told the family that he was sorry for killing their son, but it had to be done. Obviously, back in the day, it was pretty easy to find people's phone numbers. He heard it on the news that the kid's name was Bonham, so he just looked it up in the phone book and ended up calling the family, which is pretty sick in its own right. After police investigated the phone call, they had a pretty good idea of who their suspect was. Joe became the main suspect for the investigators. I'm not exactly sure how they came up to that conclusion, so they must have had run-ins with him. They pretty much had him locked in right after that phone call. So Joe, knowing that he was probably on the radar with the police, fled from Texas to Denver, Colorado. He also changed his name to disguise himself. He now called himself Joe Michael Ervin. So yeah, changed a few letters in his last name, but essentially didn't change much else. So not a great plan, but apparently it works. So Here we go. Also, why is it so easy to change your name? Did he like legally change his name to that? And how and why would it be so easy to change your name back in the day? Wouldn't you need like social security cards, like prove your identity? Or was he just out there calling himself by a different name just to keep people off his back? Like, I don't understand that either, because what we found out is he got into some trouble in Denver, Colorado, and because police were entering the wrong name, he basically got away from the arrest warrant that was for him in Texas. Like, nothing came up. So I don't understand if he actually legally changed his name to that, or if he was just calling himself that and the police didn't catch it. From 1970 to 1977, Joe Ervin would be repeatedly charged with offenses such as burglary, rape, sexually abusing children, and assault with a deadly weapon. But each time he was found guilty on grounds of diminished responsibility, meaning he didn't know right from wrong, which is completely asinine, if you ask me. Like, this guy is going around committing all of these crimes, was wanted for a murder in Texas. At least put him away. If you really think that, put him away into like some mental hospital that he can't get out until he proves that he's stable and knows right from wrong. Like, why do you just let him go? That's not an excuse for anything. I don't understand why you would just be like, well, he didn't know right from wrong, so I guess free pass. Come on. Instead of serving jail time for each one of these sentences, he was repeatedly interned at the Colorado State Hospital in Pueblo. And after months of treatment every time, he was released. So literally, he did all of these things: abused children, burglary, rape, assault with a deadly weapon. They're like, 2 months. That sounds like a good idea. 2 months and you're good. So here's where, in later investigations, it would reveal that on at least 2 occasions, typographical errors in listing Ervin's real name and date of birth failed to link him to the active arrest warrant in Texas. This basically allowed him to post bail in 2 cases of rape and theft. Attempts from the district attorney to actually raise his bail amount were met with, nah. I feel like we talk about this a lot. All of these people that just get released with like a slap on the wrist, a couple months here, a couple months there on these serious, aggressive crimes, this basically just enables them to keep doing it because they now think they're above the law. Like, oh, I just get a slap on the wrist for raping someone. Oh, I just get a slap on the wrist for burglary. Assault with a deadly weapon, 2 months. This just enables people. Like, lock these people away for years so that you don't have this happen. It's ridiculous. So Joe was released again shortly before December 7th, 1978. But on that day is when everything took a turn. So Joe is now basically just living his life. He got released on all of his stuff. No one really knows what he was doing between these times, but essentially he was like a transient. Somehow he was able to make money. He held jobs, I'm assuming, for short periods of time. But on December 7th, 1978, Madeline Fury Levidius was alone with her 2 young daughters inside her home in Denver. Madeline was an editor for a popular children's magazine, Ranger Rick. She was also a talented nature writer, explorer. She was the daughter of a former mayor of a nearby town. So this family was like very accomplished and she loved her life. She was able to stay at home with their daughters. She had a husband that worked full time, but she basically worked from home a lot and was able to enjoy that type of life. So setting the scene on this December day, it was getting close to Christmas. Everyone was in the holiday spirit. Around the city, all of the Christmas trees were up and decorated. The city lights were on. I mean, it was Denver, Colorado lit up for Christmas. So super peaceful time. Madeline was at home by herself getting her kids ready for the day. There was a knock at her front door. Getting a knock at the door this early in the morning seemed a bit strange, but she didn't really think anything of it. As she swung the door open, she was immediately attacked. Their 9-month-old daughter Ariel and the 3-year-old daughter Molly were basically helpless. They didn't really know what was going on. But Joe, as soon as that door opened, immediately attacked Madeline and basically pushed her into a bedroom. He then pulled out a knife and stabbed her several times, killing her. Then walked out the door. When Antonio came home that night from work, he knew immediately something was wrong. He told police that he found his 9-month-old daughter Ariel in a swing on the back porch and his 3-year-old daughter Molly watching TV in the dark. So obviously, as soon as he walked into the door, he knew something was wrong. There were no signs of forced entry, and robbery wasn't a motive because he left a ton of stuff there. As Antonio swung his bedroom door open, there his wife was laying motionless on the ground. The worst part about this whole story was the Denver Police Department basically didn't investigate this because they were so overwhelmed at the time from all of the murders that were happening in their city that they didn't have enough staff to do anything about this murder. So it basically went uninvestigated, like nothing was done, which just goes to show they probably had a super high crime rate because whoever was allowing these people to be released, they were just recommitting crimes. Like, it's a pretty simple solution. Start locking these people up and you might solve some crimes here. I mean, it's pretty much a no-brainer when you think about it. This judge just keeps letting people go. Yeah, 2 months, rape, sexual assault, breaking and entering, assault with a deadly weapon. 2 months sounds about right. Like, you keep letting these people go, and now you have this huge problem on your hands. You can't keep up with the amount of murders that are happening in your city. And now you're not even investigating the murders because there are so many. You don't have enough staff to do it. So essentially, Joe gets away with another murder and is still walking the streets because at this time, we're just not investigating murders. We don't have the manpower. So a few years later, on August 10th, 1980, Joe is getting the itch again. So setting the scene on this day, it's early morning hours between 5 and 7 a.m. in Denver. 53-year-old Dolores Barreras was walking down the street like she always did that morning. She was on her way to her job working in a cafeteria at the Fairmont Hotel nearby. Dolores was visiting her family for the summer and decided to get a job to make some extra money while she was there. Her plan was to move back out of state after the summer was over. With it being August 10th, summer was pretty much over. In fact, it was actually her last day of work at the hotel. Dolores was married. She was a mother, a grandmother, and just super loving to all of her family. Obviously, she wanted to be close to everyone. She was visiting Denver for the summer to be with family. It was still dark that morning. The sun was just barely lighting up the sky a little bit. The streets were very dimly lit, not enough to really see anything. As Dolores is walking, out of the corner of her eye, she sees something move. Before she could even react, Joe jumped her, pushing her to the ground. As soon as she hit the ground, she began getting stabbed. Joe, in a fit of rage, stabbed her so many times, Dolores essentially died immediately. He then dragged her body off the sidewalk and placed it near an apartment building. Her body was found about an hour later and reported to police around 7 a.m. Now, police were still pretty much buried with crime at that time, and they kind of chalked this up to like a random incident. They didn't really have anything to go on. There was pretty much no evidence. So, Joe continues to walk the streets for the next 4 months. It's now December 20th of 1980. 27-year-old Gwendolyn Harris was out at one of her favorite hangout spots, the Polo Club. Water polo. Basically, where they play water polo and where all the people that play water polo hang out. She was last seen that night in the lounge of the Polo Club. Gwendolyn was a mother, a sister, daughter, an aunt. She was very soft-spoken, well-liked in the community. She was always cheerful and could brighten up a room just by her presence. Nobody knows exactly what happened that night. However, it's suspected that Gwendolyn was walking home after hanging out at the Polo Club. As she was walking, she was attacked and stabbed to death, just like Dolores 4 months earlier. Her body was found early the next morning. Police couldn't identify her until an autopsy came back, and finally they were able to put a name to the victim. Before they were able to identify her, police put a bulletin out asking the public for any information. They said it was a black woman in her early 20s, about 5'4", weighing 140 pounds. They didn't suspect this was a robbery either because Gwendolyn was left with $70 and a black wig. The autopsy also revealed that she was stabbed over 20 times. Police would later find out that this murder took place just blocks away from where Joe Ervin was staying at the time. They also didn't connect Gwendolyn's murder with Dolores's murder. They literally happened the exact same way. They were both attacked while walking on the street with a knife, then left for dead. How do you not at least be like, these might be connected? It's not a robbery. It's just a random attack with stabbing victims. But police weren't able to connect them. So again, Joe Ervin is still walking the streets. The very next month, on January 24th, 1981, Joe killed his next victim, 17-year-old Antoinette Parks. She was the youngest of all of his victims. She grew up in Denver with her family. She loved to sing, play music, had a special bond with children, and was actually aspiring to be either a school teacher or counselor. What people didn't know was she was 6 weeks pregnant at the time and was expecting a child. Not to mention, Antoinette was the youngest of 6 growing up. Her 2 brothers during a press conference mentioned they were the only 2 siblings left in this entire family.
Have peace knowing who did this to my little sister. Me and my brother are the only remaining siblings of 6 children. I wore a shirt today in memory of all my siblings. And I lost these 2 sisters. They were the oldest. One in 2018 to a car wreck on First and Knox here in Denver. The second one died from heartbreak from the car wreck. Of course, you guys know my little sister Antoinette died in '81. And my little sister Rhonda, she passed last year, September 9th, to cancer.
They have endured heartbreak after heartbreak, and this just adds on to it. The day she was murdered, she was visiting her boyfriend at his house. They got into an argument, and obviously being upset, she decided to just leave the situation. Antoinette stormed off and left the house. She was just going to go home for the night to calm down. That would be the last time anyone saw her alive. Her body was found in a nearby field with over 20 stab wounds. It was also found that a stick had been inserted into her to try to kill the baby. So being 6 weeks pregnant, you're probably just starting to show, I would think. So this is a very sick individual that would see that and try to kill the baby. But again, police didn't link any of these stabbing victims to each other. So they just think these are random murders. It's not a coincidence that 3 women are stabbed to death in the exact same way, and they don't link them together. Like, who is investigating these? So Joe Ervin is still walking the streets. 6 months go by. We still don't know what Joe is doing. Is he holding a job? Is he a drifter? How does he make money? What is he doing? No one really knows. However, it's now June 27th of 1981, and Joe's drunk. He decides to get behind the wheel and drive. 26-year-old police officer Sue Corr gets behind him and notices that he's driving erratically. She decides to pull him over to do a little investigation as to why he's driving so crazy. During the traffic stop, Officer Corr attempted to place Joe in handcuffs for suspicion of drunk driving. Before she could even get the second cuff on him, Joe turns around and starts attacking her. He manages to get control of Officer Corr's gun, shoots her, and kills her instantly. While this scuffle was happening, Glenn Spies, who was like a community service officer, he wasn't actually a police officer. He kind of worked with the police department to help them out on like traffic things. But he was driving by in his civilian vehicle, saw the scuffle, and actually got out to try to help Officer Corr. As Joe shot Officer Core, he then turned his attention to Glenn and started shooting at him as well. Glenn did get shot, but it wasn't enough to kill him. He decided to take cover behind his vehicle and call for help. Thankfully, Joe just wanted to get out of there. He got back in his vehicle and took off. Obviously, the shooting was reported and a ton of officers swarmed the area. Shortly after the incident, they knew exactly who it was that killed their officer and shot Glenn because she had already called it out and got some of his information. So they decided to go to Joe's house to arrest him. As they kick in his door to his house, Joe is sitting there trying to saw off the handcuff that was placed on him by Officer Core. They arrested him without incident. He was charged with her murder. While awaiting trial, Joe was in a solitary confinement cell. He was able to take a towel from his cell and hang himself with a makeshift noose. After he was pronounced dead, they searched his cell and found a suicide note in which Joe expresses remorse for his crimes and begged for forgiveness. Well, Joe, you're not forgiven, and I hope you rot in hell. So, there you go. Due to Joe's death, his first victim, Bonham, and Officer Core's murders were officially closed. They were able to tie those two together based on his name, obviously. So they closed those two murders. What they didn't know was he had 4 other murders that were outstanding. So just looking back on this whole progression, the first murder that was committed by Joe used a gun to kill 21-year-old Rodney Bonham in the bowling alley parking lot. Police put out a warrant for his arrest in that case. However, Joe moved to Denver and changed his name. Then he committed 4 other murders by means of stabbing. I have no clue how those didn't get connected to each other, but for some reason they didn't. Then you have the last murder, Officer Core, who basically was able to put an end to this whole thing. The stabbing murders went unsolved for the next 44 years. In 2013, there was a cold case unit put together in Denver. This unit started combing through the unsolved murder cases. They decided to run some DNA through their current technology and got a hit matching 2 unsolved murders. Madeline Levidius, who was murdered while watching her 2 young daughters, and Dolores Barreras, who was murdered while walking to work. They found the same DNA profile on those 2 murders. So they now know those were committed by the same person. They continue to run DNA from old cold cases through their new DNA technology and came back with 2 more. Gwendolyn Harris and Antoinette Parks were both linked to the same unidentified male. They now have linked the 4 murderers to one person, but they don't know who it is. Antoinette's case was also very interesting. They didn't actually have stored DNA, but what they did have was a vial that used to have DNA in it, no longer did, but what they decided was to just try to swab that vial for DNA anyway and see what they could come up with. It actually worked. There was enough DNA residue left in that vial that they were able to get a hit. It was at this point that the cold case unit was getting a little nervous. They knew they uncovered a serial killer. However, they had no clue if this person was still active, they didn't know what they were really chasing. They had to basically go through and rule out, like, ooh, is this person still killing people? Like, we got to look at our current cases. We got to go look through all of these cold cases to see how many more murders this person could be linked to. So they decided to fast track the process and try to use Ancestry DNA. As you probably know, Ancestry DNA is a company that traces your ancestry back to your very distant relatives. They run DNA through a database similar to a police database to find close and distant relatives that share similar DNA as you. This process that the police are trying to use isn't easy because when you submit DNA to it, it comes back with a plethora of results. So the investigation is still ongoing, and now they have to comb through like 100 people to see if any of those people were in the areas of Denver at that time. And if they weren't there, they could be ruled out. But essentially, they have to go through that whole list of people to be like, okay, is this person a viable option? Were they in Denver? What was their life like? Who else are they connected to? So the investigation did not end there when they finally got that Ancestry DNA hit. However, after this whole thing, they were able to narrow it down to one person, Joe Ervin. He was in the area at the time of all the murders. He fit the profile, but they knew from records that Joe has been dead for 44 years now. So they had to get permission to exhume his body to check for the DNA evidence and finally get their match. They did finally get the permission, exhumed his body, got DNA samples, and boom, they found their person. They were now able to solve these cold cases after 44 years. So that is my true crime cold case story of Joe Michael Ervin. If you enjoy this content, please like and subscribe to my page. I love creating this content. It just takes me a while because I still work a full-time job and I need to put it all together and work on it. So if you like this content, help me out, subscribe to my page, and I will keep posting. So thanks everyone. Bye.